The dust had not yet settled from the hooves when Cora Vaughn recognized the markings on the lead mare. She recognized the pale star on the forehead first, then the white sock on the left foreleg, and her heart seized so violently inside her chest that she pressed both hands flat against the porch railing to keep herself upright. 7 horses. All 7 of the ones taken from her in the dead of night 3 weeks ago, when she had woken to silence where there should have been breathing, and discovered the corral gate hanging open and the paddock empty as a broken promise. 7 horses that represented every cent she had left in this world after the bank had taken the deed, and the creditors had circled like vultures and her foreman had vanished with the payroll money he was supposed to distribute. And here they were, walking up the dusty lane toward her ranch house at dusk, led by a man she did not know. He sat tall in the saddle of a black horse that was not one of hers, and he wore a dark coat over a collarless shirt, and he had the kind of face that had been arranged by hard weather into something almost beautiful, all sharp angles and careful stillness. He was leading her 7 horses on a single long rope strung from one bridle to the next, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has been watching for longer than she knows. Cora stepped off the porch. She did not reach for the rifle leaning against the doorframe, though she thought about it. She walked down the 2 steps and across the dry yard and stopped 12 feet from him when he stopped his horse, because 12 feet felt like the minimum distance at which she could make a clear decision about who this man was. He dismounted without being invited to. That irritated her. "Those are my horses," she said. "Yes," he said. "They are." His voice was lower than she expected, and there was no apology in it, but there was something else she could not immediately name. "Who are you?" she asked. He unwound the lead rope from his saddle horn and held it out to her. She did not take it yet. "My name is Orville Malone," he said. The name hit her like a flat stone thrown at close range. She had heard it before, most recently from the deputy sheriff in Caldwell, who had pressed a wanted circular into her hands 2 months ago and said, "This man has been operating in the county. Lock your doors, Miss Vaughn." She had not locked her doors because she could not afford to live afraid, but she had memorized the face on that circular, and the face in front of her now matched it well enough to make her breath go short. Orville Malone, bank jobs in 3 counties, stage robberies, wanted by the federal marshal's office, an outlaw standing in her yard holding the rope attached to her 7 missing horses. "Where did you find them?" she managed. "I did not exactly find them," he said. "I took them back." The silence between those words and her response lasted long enough for a crow to cross the sky above them. "You took them back," she repeated. "From the men who stole them," he said. His eyes did not waver from hers. They were gray, she noticed, the color of river stones, and they carried something in them that she could only describe as a dark and private kind of honor. "Nobody should profit from taking what is yours." That sentence fell into her with a weight entirely out of proportion to its 7 words, and she would turn it over in her mind for weeks afterward, examining it from every angle, trying to understand why it reached her so deeply in a place she had thought sealed up tight since her husband died, and left her alone with a mortgaged ranch and a broken season, and a silence that never quite went away. She took the rope. She had to understand how she had arrived at this moment. She had to go back to the beginning, because nothing about Orville Malone or the events of the past 3 weeks had been simple, and love, she would come to understand, rarely announced itself honestly when it first arrived. The year was 1882, and Cora Vaughn was 28 years old, which felt both ancient and devastatingly young depending on the hour and the light. She had come to the territory of Kansas with her husband James Vaughn 6 years prior, when he was full of ambition, and she was full of faith in his ambition. And for 3 years they had built something real and fragile and worth protecting out of the grassland north of Caldwell. A horse ranch. Not cattle, which everyone ran, but horses, because James understood horses the way some men understand music, with his whole body and without having to think about it, and Cora had learned to love them with the same fluency he did. James died of a fever in the winter of 1880, which was the same winter the first banknote came due, and the savings account held less than she had believed, because James, for all his gifts with horses, had possessed a dark past relationship with bookkeeping and a tendency to borrow against the future. Cora had not fallen apart. She had squared herself against the loss and the debt, and the long work of survival the same way she squared herself against a Kansas wind, with her whole body leaned into it, not fighting the force but redirecting it, bending without breaking. She hired 2 hands, a Mexican man named Eduardo Reyes who knew horses as well as James had, and a young man from Missouri named Pete Lusk who was competent and quiet and trustworthy. She bred and sold horses and made the payments and kept the accounts herself this time, checking and rechecking every column. And then the summer of 1882 brought a triple betrayal that arrived so quickly and from so many directions that it felt almost designed. First, a man named Gerald Fowler arrived in Caldwell claiming to hold a secondary lien on the Vaughn property, a document she had never seen, that James had apparently signed 4 years prior in a transaction she had not been party to. Gerald Fowler was not a man who generated trust. He was thick-necked and smooth-spoken and wore his suit slightly too tight, and the lien document had the smell of something arranged rather than something earned. But the county magistrate, who was Fowler's cousin by marriage, found it valid, and Cora was given 60 days to produce $300 or face forced sale of a portion of her land. $300, an enormous sum, enough to hollow her out for 2 years of savings. Then her foreman, a man named Dale Cutter who she had hired 6 months prior based on solid-seeming references, disappeared one Tuesday morning with $40 of payroll money and the better part of her tack room's inventory. He took saddles, bridles, a good lasso collection, and a rifle she had bought the previous fall. The theft was brazen and deliberate and felt personal in a way that pure opportunism never quite does. And then, 3 weeks before Orville Malone appeared in her yard, she woke at 4 in the morning to silence. The corral was empty. The paddock gate was open. All 7 of her best horses were gone, including the lead mare, Duchess, who was the foundation of her breeding program and worth more than anything else on the property combined. Duchess was a registered Morgan mare with a bloodline that Cora had spent 3 years carefully developing, and without her, the ranch's future collapsed completely. Cora had reported the theft to the sheriff, a man named Calvin Hartley who was competent and overworked, and who had told her plainly that horse theft rings were operating through the entire county, and that her horses were probably already in Indian territory or worse. He promised to post notices. He promised to alert the federal marshal. He did both of those things, but nothing came of either. Eduardo had ridden out on his own for 3 days and returned empty-handed, his expression careful and controlled in the way of a man who has not found what he was looking for and is too kind to say so. Pete Lusk had done the same and returned with a grim mouth and said nothing. Cora had borrowed against herself to cover the immediate expenses, reduced to a kind of financial desperation that she had never experienced and had not believed she was capable of, because believing you might one day be truly desperate is a form of surrender she had never allowed herself. She was sitting on the porch at dusk on the 22nd day, 3 days before the 60-day window on Fowler's lien would close, staring at the empty corral, when 7 horses appeared at the end of her lane. And now she was standing in the yard holding their lead rope, and Orville Malone was standing 3 feet in front of her, and she did not know what to do with any of it. "Come inside," she heard herself say, which surprised her nearly as much as it clearly surprised him. He hesitated exactly once, the first hesitation she had seen from him, and then he tied his horse to the post and followed her. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the coffee she had left sitting on the stove because she had not eaten dinner and had lost track of time sitting on that porch. She poured 2 cups without asking him if he wanted one, because she needed something to do with her hands, and she set one in front of him and sat across the table and looked at him directly. He was perhaps 30 years old, possibly a year or two older. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw that had healed clean, and a slightly crooked line to his nose that told the same story bones tell. His hands wrapped around the coffee cup with a kind of unconscious care that people develop only when they have held fragile things, and she noticed the calluses on his palms and the precise trim of his nails, and found herself constructing a portrait of him from these small details the way you construct a landscape from individual brushstrokes. "Tell me how you found them," she said. He drank the coffee. He considered his answer in the deliberate way of a man who lies rarely enough that honesty requires a little preparation. "I know the men who run the horse ring," he said. "I have known them for some time. They operate out of a spread south of Medicine Lodge, and they move animals into Indian territory through a contact at the border. Your horses were 3 days from crossing over permanently when I got to them." "You know these men," she said slowly. "I ran with them," he said, "for a time." There it was, the confirmation of what she had suspected and feared and needed to hear plainly. She held very still. "And yet you took my horses back," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Because I knew they were yours," he said. "I had heard about the Vaughn place, the widow who was fighting to keep it, the stolen horses." He paused. "What was done to you was not a coincidence, Miss Vaughn. Dale Cutter did not steal your tack by chance, and those horses were not taken by chance. Gerald Fowler and the men who run the horse ring are connected, and the connection is deliberate. They are working together to force you off your land." The air in the kitchen changed. She felt it as a physical thing, a pressure change, as if a storm front had arrived without warning. "Say that again," she said. "Gerald Fowler arranged the theft," Orville said. "Cutter was his man. The lien is designed to run simultaneously with the horse theft so that you have no assets to draw on to meet it. When you default on the lien, Fowler acquires part of your land at below market price through his cousin's court. Then the horse ring sells your animals, splits the profit with Cutter, and Fowler ends up with the land he wants without having to pay fair value for it." Cora set down her coffee cup. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about James and his broken books, and the lien she had never seen, and the way Gerald Fowler had smiled at her when he delivered the lien notice. A smile that she had categorized as unpleasant without understanding that it was the smile of a man who believes he has already won. "How do you know all of this?" she asked. "Because Cutter came to the ring with the horses and told the whole story," Orville said. "He thought it was clever. He thought it was a clean score. He did not consider that someone might find it less amusing than he did." "You," she said. "I," he confirmed. She studied him for a long moment. The lamplight moved across his face, catching the gray of his eyes and the hard line of his jaw, and she felt something complicated and unwanted begin to assemble itself inside her chest. She did not know enough about this man to trust him. She had every reason not to. He was wanted by federal authorities. He had ridden with criminals. He carried secrets behind his eyes the way a gun carries a bullet in the chamber, ready but controlled, and he had returned her horses. "There are 3 days left on the lien," she said. "Even with the horses back, I do not have $300. "I know," he said. "Then returning the horses, while I am grateful for it, does not resolve the larger problem." "No," he agreed. "It does not." Another silence, longer this time. "Are you offering to help me with the larger problem?" She asked, and she was careful to make the question neutral because she did not know what she wanted the answer to be. He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Why?" "Because what is being done to you is wrong," he said. "And because I have spent a considerable number of years profiting from other people's losses, and I have grown tired of the arithmetic of that life." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months, possibly longer, and the honesty of it struck her with a force that she had not anticipated. "If I accept your help," she said carefully, "I need to know something first." "Ask it." "Are you a man who can be trusted to do what he says he will do?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man taking the question seriously. In all the years I have been doing things I should not have done, he said finally. I have never once broken my word to a person who was honest with me. That is not much of a recommendation, but it is the honest one. Cora Vaughn looked at Orville Malone across the table in her kitchen, with the lamp burning and the Kansas dark pressing against the windows and 7 horses she had thought were lost forever standing in her corral, and she made a decision. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you propose." What he proposed was both simpler and more dangerous than she expected. The lien document was fraudulent, he explained. Not the lien itself, which had been properly recorded, but the underlying transaction, the one James was supposed to have signed. He had seen the original Fowler document when Cutter was talking, and there were inconsistencies in it that an experienced eye would catch. Specifically, the signature on the document was dated in the spring of 1878, 2 months before James Vaughn had arrived in Kansas, which meant James could not possibly have signed it in Caldwell as the document claimed. "If you can get access to travel records," Orville said, "stage manifests, hotel registers, anything that places James Vaughn outside of Kansas in the spring of 1878, the lien falls apart." "The document is forged." Cora went very still. "James traveled to St. Louis in February of 1878, she said slowly. "He was there until at least June. I have letters, I have the stage receipt for his return journey." "Show them to anyone other than the county magistrate," Orville said. "The territorial judge in Wichita, the federal marshal, anyone above Fowler's reach." "Can we get to Wichita in 3 days? 2 days on good horses," he said. And there it was, a plan. A fragile, high-stakes plan that depended on documents and timing, and the chance that justice had not been entirely purchased in this part of the world, but a plan nonetheless. They left before dawn the next morning. Cora had debated whether to bring Eduardo or Pete, and then decided against it, because she did not know who else Fowler's network of betrayal reached, and she could not afford another hidden motive surfacing at the worst possible moment. She left Eduardo in charge of the horses and told him simply that she was going to Wichita on legal business and would return in 3 days. And Eduardo looked at Orville Malone the way all men of experience look at other men of experience, with a brief, calibrating assessment, and then said nothing. She packed the letters in a leather satchel that she kept inside her coat, because the morning was cold even in summer on the open plains, and she and Orville rode north on 2 of her horses while his black horse was given the corral and a bucket of grain. The first hour was mostly silence, which she spent organizing her thoughts, and he spent scanning the horizon with the habitual vigilance of a man who expects to be followed. Which, she realized after a while, he very possibly was. "Are you in danger from the ring?" she asked, when the silence had gone on long enough to feel like a missed opportunity. "Possibly," he said. "When they discover the horses are gone, they will know it was me. There are not many people who knew where those horses were, and I am the only one who would have reason to return them. Reason being your newly discovered conscience," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and was not entirely sorry for it. He glanced at her sideways. Something that was almost a smile moved across his mouth and disappeared. "Something like that," he said. The plains spread out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful, the grass still green from the June rains, and the sky carrying the particular blue of early summer mornings. Cora had lived in this landscape for 6 years and still found it capable of surprising her. It did not shrink you, this country. It simply reminded you that you were the size you were, no larger, no smaller, and that the work of staying alive in it required constant honesty about your own dimensions. "Tell me about yourself," she said, because she needed to understand him better, and there was no subtle way to acquire that understanding. "What would you like to know? Where you are from, how you came to be what you are. Whether there is anyone who would be made sad by your death, which might become relevant given your assessment of our danger." He was quiet for a moment, but it was not the quiet of refusal. "I am from Missouri originally," he said, "a farm near Springfield." My father died when I was 15 and my mother remarried badly. The man she married had a dark past that she was not aware of until he showed her the shape of it. A brief pause. I left when I was 17, fell in with some men who were making their way west and making their way dishonestly, and found that I was good at what they were doing, which is one of the most dangerous forms of bad luck a young man can have. And the robbery and so forth, she said. Banks mostly, he said. Which I told myself was not like stealing from a person. Banks are institutions. Banks hold other people's money and make profit from it and rarely apologize. I told myself many things. Another pause. Then I watched a man I robbed with spend a woman's house savings on whiskey and cards, and he did not care at all that her life had just been made smaller by what we had done, and I found I cared about it more than I thought I did. She looked at him. That was 3 years ago, he said. I have been working my way out of that world since then, slowly. These things do not come apart quickly. And yet you ended up riding with a horse theft ring. Ended up is not exactly accurate, he said. I followed them in deliberately to find out what they were doing and where they were operating from. I had heard about a horse ring working the southern counties, and I wanted to know if it was the same network that had been connected to a killing I knew about. It was not, but I had already spent 3 weeks establishing myself with them by the time I knew that. A killing you knew about, she said. He nodded once slowly. A man I was responsible for leading into that world. He died because of work I organized, and the specific men who pulled the trigger were never found. I was looking for them. The confession landed between them quietly. No drama in the delivery, no request for her sympathy. Just the clean, terrible honesty of a man accounting for what he had done. Cora did not say anything for a while. The horses moved steadily under them, and the grass whispered, and the sky went from blue to the brighter, harder blue of mid-morning, and somewhere to the west a meadowlark was building a song out of the silence. "Did you find them?" she asked eventually. "The men who killed your friend?" "One of them," he said. "The other is still unaccounted for." She took that in. "I am sorry," she said, "about your friend." He looked at her, and the look lasted a beat longer than the conversation strictly required. "Thank you," he said. They stopped at noon to water the horses at a creek that cut through a low fold in the prairie, and she unpacked the provisions she had brought, cold biscuits and salted beef, and a canteen of coffee that was still faintly warm. They sat on opposite banks of the creek with the horses drinking between them, and the midday light made the water silver and the grass gold and everything very sharp and very quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The men in the ring. When they discover what you have done, what will they do, and how far will they follow?" "Luther Crane will send men," he said. Luther Crane was the name of the ring's leader, a name she had not heard before but which she filed carefully in her memory. He takes betrayal personally. It is one of the things about him that made him successful and one of the things that makes him genuinely dangerous. "And Dale Cutter, is he with Crane?" "Cutter is with whoever pays best," Orville said. "But yes, he has been working with Crane for some time. He is the one who brought Fowler's arrangement to Crane originally." "So Cutter and Fowler are both threats?" "Yes," he said simply. She looked at the creek and felt the full weight of what she was carrying settle over her. The debt, the theft, the deliberate conspiracy to take from her what she had built with grief and labor and will. The anger that moved through her was clean and cold, not the hot combustive rage of immediate insult, but the quieter, more implacable fury of someone who has understood the full scope of the betrayal arranged against them. She was going to fight for this. "I have been afraid since the horses were taken," she said. "Not of the loss exactly, of what the loss means. If I lose the ranch, I lose the thing James and I built together, and I lose the future I was building for myself, and I lose the horses." She looked across the water at Orville. "I will not lose those things to men like Fowler and Cutter and Crane. I refuse." Something moved in his expression, something that looked very much like admiration and something that looked very much like recognition, as if she had described a feeling he understood precisely. "Then we keep riding," he said. They reached the outskirts of Wichita late the following afternoon. having slept in shifts the previous night in a shallow hollow off the trail, because Orville had spotted riders on the horizon that afternoon who were moving with too much purpose to be coincidental. He had woken her at 2 in the morning, and they had ridden quietly through the dark for 3 hours before he judged the distance safe. And those 3 hours in the deep Kansas dark had been the strangest and most intimate hours she had spent with anyone since James. Not intimate in the obvious way. In the way that darkness collapses the distance between people, removing the social scaffolding of eye contact and expression, and leaving only voice and presence and the sound of shared breathing. She had asked him, somewhere in the second hour, what he would do after this was settled. He had been quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "I cannot keep running. The federal warrant will not resolve itself, and I am tired of the weight of it. There is a marshal in Wichita named Davis who has a reputation for hearing the full story before making a decision. I had thought I might speak to him while we are there. Turn yourself in." She asked, and she was surprised by the constriction in her chest that the possibility produced. "Not turn myself in precisely," he said, "but speak to him, make a case for cooperation. There are things I know about operations in the territory that the marshal's office would value. That kind of information sometimes buys a different kind of future." "It might also buy a jail cell," she said. "Yes," he said, "it might." The honesty of it again. The clean, unadorned honesty that she kept encountering in him, and that kept doing something unexpected to her internal architecture. "If it does," she said, "I will speak for you, whatever my word is worth." Another silence, longer this time. "Miss Vaughn," he said finally, and his voice had gone quieter, "you do not owe me anything of that kind." "I know I do not owe it," she said. "I am offering it. There is a difference." She could not see his face in the dark, but she heard his exhale, slow and deliberate, and then he said, "Thank you," in the same way he had said it before, stripped of everything except the bare true meaning of the words. Wichita in the summer of 1882 was a town in the process of becoming respectable, which is always a slightly uneasy state for a frontier town. The cattle trade had moved the wildness further west, and the civic institutions were establishing themselves with the self-important energy of structures that have recently been built and are not entirely certain they will last. The federal marshal's office occupied a solid brick building on Douglas Avenue, and the territorial courthouse was 2 blocks north, and both looked like they intended to remain where they were indefinitely, which was reassuring. They went to the courthouse first. Territorial Judge Abraham Holt was a tall, spare man in his 60s, who had the kind of face that had heard many lies, and was therefore extraordinarily sensitive to the texture of truth. He listened to Cora's account without interrupting, examined the letters from James's 1878 stay in St. Louis, and the stage receipt with the careful attention of a man who reads documents the way other people read landscapes. And then he asked 3 precise clarifying questions that told her he already understood the situation completely, and was simply confirming what he had assembled from her account. "The lien document claims execution in Caldwell, Kansas on March the 14th, 1878, he said, "and this stage receipt places your husband departing St. Louis on the return journey to Kansas on July the 2nd, 1878. "Yes, sir," Cora said. "Which means the alleged Caldwell execution precedes Mr. Vaughn's arrival in Kansas by at minimum several months." "That is my reading of it, yes." Judge Holt set the documents down and laced his fingers together on the desk, and regarded her with the expression of a man who has seen this variety of fraud before and finds it no more charming with repetition. "I will issue an order vacating the lien and requiring a formal fraud investigation," he said. "That investigation will be directed to the Territorial Attorney General's office rather than the county, given the magistrate's apparent conflict of interest. The 60-day period is hereby suspended pending the investigation's outcome." Cora felt something large and tight release in her chest. "Thank you, Judge Holt," she said. The thanks belong to the fact that your husband kept his correspondence, the judge said dryly. Good record-keeping has prevented more injustices than good intentions. As they left the courthouse, Orville was quiet in a different way than his earlier quiet. She recognized it as the quiet of a man organizing himself for something difficult. "You are going to the marshal's office," she said. "Yes. Now." "The longer I wait, the more likely someone else decides the conversation for me," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. "I am coming with you," she said. "That is not necessary." "I know it is not necessary. I told you before, I am aware of the difference between obligation and choice." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray Riverstone eyes, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name but easy to feel, like a door opening in a room you did not know had a door. "All right," he said. Marshal Caleb Davis was younger than Cora expected, no more than 45, with a military bearing and a reading of men's characters that appeared to happen very quickly and very accurately behind steady brown eyes. He looked at Orville Malone the way you look at someone whose name you have seen on paper many times and are now encountering in 3 dimensions for the first time. "Malone," he said. "Marshal Davis," Orville said. "Sit down," the marshal said. He looked at Cora. "And you are?" "Cora Vaughn," she said. "I own a horse ranch north of Caldwell. Mr. Malone returned 7 horses stolen from me 3 weeks ago and has provided material assistance in a fraud case involving a forged land lien. I am here as a witness to his recent conduct." Marshal Davis looked from her to Orville and back. "Recent conduct," he said. "That is what I said," Cora said. Whatever Orville felt about her precise and deliberate framing of this, she could not tell from his expression, but she thought she saw a muscle move in his jaw. What followed was a 2-hour conversation in Marshal Davis's office, during which Orville provided specific information about Luther Crane's operation, the location of the ranch south of Medicine Lodge, the names of the men in the ring, the contact at the Indian Territory border, the route they used, and the names of 3 other thefts besides Cora's that he had direct knowledge of. He was methodical and specific in the way of someone who has been preparing for this conversation for longer than this afternoon. Marshal Davis wrote everything down without comment until the end, and then he put his pen down and looked at Orville steadily. "This is useful information," he said. "Yes," Orville said. "You understand that the federal warrants outstanding against you are not canceled by the provision of this information." "I understand that." "What I can offer," Davis said slowly, "is a formal cooperation agreement, which the marshal's office has the authority to execute in cases where the information provided leads to multiple arrests and convictions. Under such an agreement, sentences are reduced or in some cases suspended, provided the cooperating individual commits to certain ongoing conditions." He paused. "Including relocation to a jurisdiction where the existing warrants are not primary, and registration with the local law enforcement in that jurisdiction." Orville said nothing for a moment. "What does relocation mean in practice?" he asked. "It means you do not stay in the counties where you are known," Davis said. "It means you build a new life somewhere in the territory, under your own name, without running. It means the marshal's office knows where to find you, and you know where to find us." "That is not a jail cell," Cora said quietly, almost to herself. "No," Davis agreed, glancing at her. "It is not." Orville Malone sat in the marshal's office chair for a long moment, and Cora watched the internal negotiation move across his face, the way a man reconciles his dark past with the possibility of a future that does not resemble it, the way someone learns to put down a weight they have been carrying so long that the putting down feels nearly as strange as the carrying. "All right," he said. "I agree." They rode back to Caldwell over the following 2 days, and the rides were different from the rides to Wichita. Less urgent, less shadowed, the threat of pursuit less immediate because Marshal Davis had dispatched 2 deputies south before they left, headed for Medicine Lodge with warrants for Luther Crane and the ring's operations. Dale Cutter's name was on a separate warrant that Davis had told the Caldwell sheriff to execute. Gerald Fowler was facing a fraud investigation from the Territorial Attorney General's office. The trap that had been set for Cora was being taken apart, piece by piece, by the institutional machinery she had needed but had not been able to reach alone. And she was riding through the Kansas summer beside Orville Malone, who had a cooperation agreement folded in his inside coat pocket, and the slightly dazed expression of a man who has just been given something he had privately stopped believing he deserved. They talked for hours, about Missouri, where he had grown up, and which he had not permitted himself to be sentimental about until now. About Kansas, which she had chosen and which had chosen her back in the complicated way that places choose you, by being difficult enough to require your full commitment, and then rewarding it with something that feels like belonging. About horses, which was a subject on which they discovered they could talk without any effort at all, because she knew Morgan bloodlines and he knew quarter horses, and the conversation about the relative merits and particular intelligences of different breeds occupied the better part of an afternoon, and ended in a disagreement about endurance versus speed that neither of them was willing to fully concede, which made them both laugh. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a low, warm sound that she filed away in the same internal place where she had been filing the gray eyes and the careful hands and the unadorned honesty. On the second evening, camped on the open plain with a fire going and the horses picketed nearby, she asked him what he had thought about when he decided to take her horses back from Crane's operation. He thought about the question for a while. "I heard Cutter tell the story of what he had done," he said. "The arrangement with Fowler, the theft, the way the timing was designed to break you before you could recover. And I had heard about you before that, just as I told you. The widow who was fighting for her land, who would not be run off." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I have spent years involved in actions that made other people's lives smaller, in taking from people the things they had worked for, and I convinced myself that this was the nature of the world and that I was simply honest about participating in it rather than pretending I was not." He paused. "Hearing Cutter talk about what he had done to you, I felt the falseness of all the arguments I had made to myself. I could not sit there and let it continue." "That was a very large risk," she said. "Taking 7 horses from Luther Crane's operation, knowing he would discover it and knowing he would pursue you." "Yes," he agreed. "You took that risk for someone you had never met." "I had a picture of you," he said, and then seemed faintly surprised that he had said it. She went very still. "A picture?" "Crane had acquired one somehow. I do not know how. It was a portrait photograph. I do not know when it was taken." He paused. "It did not matter, but I am telling you because you asked what I was thinking about, and that is the honest account of it." Cora looked at the fire. She was 31 years old now. She corrected herself internally because it had been 28 at the lien notice and 3 months had passed. She was a widow who had learned to run a ranch alone and hold grief at arm's length and make hard decisions without the support of someone who loved her, and she had believed for some time that this was simply the shape of the life available to her, the shape she had been left with. She felt the shape of it changing. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the feeling of a wall you have leaned against for years becoming a door, which requires you to stand upright on your own before you can move through it. "Orville," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. "I do not know what is on the other side of all of this," she said carefully. "The investigation, the cooperation agreement, the ranch, what comes next. I do not know what your plans are, where your life is going, whether the relocation the marshal described is in this county or across the territory." "I had not decided yet," he said. "I want you to know," she said, and she chose each word carefully, "that you are welcome at the Vaughn place as long as you need to be while you are making those decisions. Not as payment for what you have done, not as obligation." She paused. "As invitation." The fire moved between them and the stars were enormous overhead and the horses breathed quietly in the dark. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Cora," she said. A silence that felt like it was changing the temperature of the air. "Cora," he said, and the word in his voice had a different weight than it had in her own head. "I would like that very much." They rode into Caldwell the next morning and directly to the sheriff's office, where Calvin Hartley informed them that the warrant for Dale Cutter had been executed the previous afternoon and Cutter was currently in county lockup, and that a federal deputy had ridden through and left word that Luther Crane and 2 of his men had been taken into custody at the Medicine Lodge operation. The remaining ring members had scattered into the territory and were being pursued. Gerald Fowler's office on Main Street was closed and locked. His landlady, when asked, said he had packed a bag the day before yesterday and departed on the northbound stage, destination unknown. The Territorial Attorney General's investigator arrived in Caldwell 3 days later and was not troubled by Fowler's absence, because the fraud investigation did not require him to be present, and the documentation of the forged lien was thorough enough that the case could proceed without his cooperation. Cora watched all of this from the vantage of her front porch, because most of the activity in the wake of the Wichita journey came to her rather than requiring her to go to it, and she spent those days in a particular state of emotional suspension, doing the work of the ranch and managing the horses and speaking with Eduardo and Pete and watching Orville Malone work. He had stayed, as she had invited him to. He worked. She had not asked him to. He had simply appeared in the barn on the first morning at 6 and been doing things that needed doing for 3 hours before she came out and found him. He was good with the horses in a way that was immediately visible, not the showy skill of a man demonstrating something, but the quiet, habitual competence of someone who has been around horses long enough to have absorbed their language entirely. Eduardo, who trusted no one quickly and said nothing unnecessary, watched Orville for 2 days and then said to Cora, in the quiet way he had, that the man worked hard and did not complain and knew a good horse from a bad one, which was Eduardo's equivalent of a formal endorsement. Pete Lusk watched Orville with rather more overt curiosity and eventually said, "He is the one from the wanted circular, is he not?" And Cora said yes, and Pete said, "But he got your horses back." And Cora said yes again, and Pete said, "All right then," and went back to what he was doing, which settled the matter as far as the Vaughn Ranch was concerned. The fraud investigation concluded 6 weeks later. The forged lien was formally vacated and expunged from the county records, and the magistrate, Fowler's cousin by marriage, resigned under separate investigation into judicial corruption. A new magistrate was appointed from Wichita. Gerald Fowler was eventually located in Kansas City, was extradited back to the territory, and was convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy charges. Dale Cutter pled guilty to theft and received a 3-year sentence. Luther Crane's case was federal and took longer, but Orville's testimony, given by written deposition through Marshal Davis's office, was central to the eventual conviction on multiple horse theft and organized crime charges. The ranch survived, more than survived. With the horses returned and the lien erased and the breeding program intact, the following autumn was the most productive Cora had experienced since James was alive. Duchess produced a foal in October that was, as Cora had hoped, an exceptional animal, a colt with the bloodline promise she had been building toward and which she named Resolution, because it seemed like the right name for a horse born at the end of a season of fighting. Orville was present for the birth. He was there because he was almost always present by then, in the easy way that someone becomes present when they have been invited and have accepted and have discovered that the place suits them more than they expected. He had written to Marshal Davis about his relocation and had received back a letter confirming that Sumner County, which contained Caldwell, was an acceptable jurisdiction for the cooperation agreement, and that the local sheriff's registration requirement could be satisfied by a simple formal meeting, which Cora had accompanied him to because she had promised to speak for him if needed. She had not been needed. Calvin Hartley, the sheriff, had heard about the returned horses and the fraud case and the arrest of Luther Crane, and had apparently formed a view of Orville that was more complex than the wanted circular suggested. The registration meeting lasted 20 minutes and concluded with Hartley shaking Orville's hand and saying he hoped the man planned to stay out of trouble, to which Orville said he planned to stay out of trouble indefinitely. And Hartley had looked at Cora and then back at Orville and said that was probably a good plan. The days on the ranch had a quality that Cora had not experienced since the early years with James, the quality of having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who was interested in the same things she was, and who noticed the same things she noticed, and who made the particular silence of the evening hours feel inhabited rather than empty. She had forgotten how much she had missed that. She had been so busy surviving the absence of it that she had not let herself feel the shape of the absence directly. She felt it now, in reverse, as a filling in. She noticed things about him with the steady accumulating attention of someone who has stopped trying not to notice. The way he was with the horses always. The way he listened fully, without the restless half-attention that most people offered in conversation. The way he never asked her to be different than she was. The way he laughed when something struck him as genuinely funny, which was rare and therefore worth a great deal. The way he had put himself at significant personal risk to do what was right for someone he did not know, because he had decided that the arithmetic of his life needed to change. She was in love with him. She discovered this fact the way you discover a geographical feature you have been living near without recognizing, suddenly aware of the mountain that has been behind you the whole time. She did not panic at the discovery. She was not 20 years old and she had loved someone before, and she knew that love was not a simple or comfortable thing. It was a serious thing, a thing that required honesty and courage, and she had plenty of both. What she did not know was whether he was in the same country she was. She thought he might be. She collected the evidence with the careful attention of a woman who has learned not to act on incomplete information. The way his eyes stayed on her face a beat too long when they were talking. The way he found reasons to be in whatever room she was in. The careful, deliberate attention he paid to everything she said, as if everything she said was worth attending to. The evening 2 weeks after the foal was born, when they were sitting on the porch after dinner, and she had told him something funny that Eduardo had said, and he had laughed, and then looked at her with an expression that was so plainly tender that she had to look away, because the directness of it was more than she could absorb while also maintaining the appearance of composure. She decided to stop maintaining the appearance of composure. It was a cold evening in November, the first real cold of the season, with frost on the ground in the morning and a sky the color of pewter that promised snow before the week was out. She had made a pot of soup and they were eating at the kitchen table, which they did most evenings now, and she set down her spoon and looked at him. "I need to say something to you," she said. He set down his own spoon. His full attention arrived as it always did without fanfare. "I have been thinking about how this started," she said. "You rode up the lane with 7 horses and said something that I have been carrying with me ever since. Nobody should profit from taking what is yours." She paused. "You said that about the horses, but I have been thinking about it in a larger sense. About the ways that grief takes things from you, that hard years take things from you, that you lose things you did not choose to lose and you do not always get them back." He was very still. "I lost James," she said. "I lost the particular shape of the life I expected to have. I lost for a while the belief that the future would be good. And then you rode up that lane and you were honest with me and you helped me, and some of those lost things have started to come back. Not James, not the years. But the belief." She looked at him directly, "and something new that I did not expect." The lamplight between them was steady and warm, and the frost was on the grass outside, and the horses were settled in the barn, and everything was very quiet. "Orville," she said, "I am in love with you. I am saying that plainly because I have learned that the only way to be is plain." He was quiet for a very long moment. Then he said, "Cora, I have been in love with you since about the 4th hour of the ride to Wichita." She blinked. "The 4th hour. You described what you were going to do to Fowler and Crane and Cutter if the law did not handle it. he said, and something that was clearly deep affection moved across his face, in very specific and entirely unflinching terms. I thought that was one of the finest things I had ever heard. She laughed. The laugh that came out of her was genuine and surprised and fuller than most of the laughs she had produced in recent years. And you said nothing, she said. I was not in a position to say something, he said. I was a wanted man with a dark past who had just committed a federal crime in your favor and was about to walk into a marshal's office and negotiate the terms of his own culpability. It did not seem like a good moment to complicate things further. And now? Now, he said, I'm a man with a cooperation agreement and a registration with the county sheriff and the suggestion that I stay out of trouble indefinitely. He paused, which is an entirely different position. She stood up and walked around the table, and he stood when she did because he was that kind of man, and when she was close enough, she put her hand on his face, her palm flat against the jaw with the healed scar, and looked at him. We are both in a different position, she said. He covered her hand with his and turned his face slightly into her palm, and it was the most vulnerable thing she had seen him do, and it was exactly the right thing. He kissed her with the same careful intensity that characterized everything he did, nothing performative in it, nothing held back, just the full true weight of what he felt brought directly to bear, and she kissed him back the same way, because she was Cora Vaughn and she had never in her life done anything at half measure. The winter was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful when you are comfortable and at leisure, but beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful when you are warm and working, and have someone beside you, and the cold outside is just the world being honest about itself while you go about your business. The horses were healthy. The ranch accounts were the best they had been since before James died. Eduardo had hired his nephew, a young man named Tomás who was 17 and would be 18 by spring, and who was already showing the same gift with horses his uncle had, and Pete Lusk had asked if Cora would mind if his sister came to stay, as she was coming off a difficult situation in Missouri and needed a change of air, and Cora had said of course, because the ranch had room and the company of more people made the place feel more like itself. Pete's sister Clara arrived in December and was 23 years old, and had the same quiet competence as her brother, and an immediate and obvious affinity for Tomás, which Pete pretended not to notice, and Eduardo pretended not to notice, and Cora and Orville discussed in the privacy of their evenings, with the shared amusement of two people who are themselves newly in love, and therefore find love appearing everywhere like a pattern they have recently learned to read. Orville had moved from the bunkhouse to the main house in December. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the quiet logical progression of two people who have established that they are in this together, and who see no reason to maintain a physical distance that their emotional reality has already closed. He kept the bunkhouse nominally his own for the sake of appearances that no one on the ranch actually required him to maintain, and Eduardo had said nothing about the arrangement, and Pete had said nothing, and Clara had said nothing, and Tomás would not have had the authority to comment even if he had wanted to, which he did not. Christmas was the first Christmas in years that felt like what it was supposed to be. They had a tree from the creek bottom, a cedar, and paper decorations that Clara had made with remarkable skill, and a dinner that was the collective production of Cora and Clara and Eduardo's wife Rosalinda, who came over from their house with 3 pies and a quantity of tamales that made Pete Lusk nearly inarticulate with pleasure. Orville sat at the table with all of them and ate and talked and laughed, and Cora watched him from across the table, this man who had been a stranger with a dark past and a wanted circular 6 months ago, and felt a very simple and clear happiness that she had not experienced for a long time. After dinner, when the others had moved to the other room, she caught his eye and he read her expression with the accuracy that she had come to take for granted, because he had always been extraordinarily good at reading her, and they went outside to the cold porch for 5 minutes, and he put his arm around her and they looked at the winter stars, which were very bright and very close feeling in the cold air. "I have something to ask you," he said. She waited. "I do not have much to offer in terms of history or standing," he said. "I have a cooperation agreement with a federal marshal and a registration with the county sheriff and a horse I have not paid for yet because we have been too busy." He paused. "What I have is this. I'm a man who knows what he wants and who does not intend to waste the rest of his life being less than honest about it. And what I want is to be here with you, working this ranch and building something, for as long as you will have me." She turned to look at him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "Yes," he said, "I am." With very little preamble, she said. "I am not a man who is good at preamble," he said, and there was a self-aware quality to it that she loved. "I am better at directness." "I have noticed," she said. "I find it one of your best qualities." She took both his hands. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He exhaled, and she heard the relief in it, the genuine held-breath relief of a man who, despite all evidence, had not been entirely certain, and she loved him more for that uncertainty than she would have loved certainty itself. They were married in February, at the county courthouse in Caldwell, with Calvin Hartley as one of the witnesses and Eduardo and Rosalinda Reyes as the others, and Pete and Clara and young Tomás all standing in the corridor, because the office was too small for all of them. It was a brief ceremony and a legal one, and when it was done, Cora Vaughn was Cora Malone, though she kept Vaughn as well because the ranch was the Vaughn place, and it had been before she arrived, and it felt right to honor that continuity. Orville Malone was, from that February day forward, a rancher. He was not the kind of rancher who had always been one, which gave him a particular quality of attention toward the work, the attentiveness of someone who arrived at a thing later than expected, and therefore does not take it for granted. He learned what he did not know from Eduardo and from Cora herself, who was the deepest source of knowledge about the Morgan breeding program and the horses' individual histories, and he brought to the work things that he had always known, practical skills and an instinct for management, and a way of solving problems calmly that had served him in the wrong arenas, and served him equally well in the right ones. In May, Cora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Orville in the evening in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where the important conversations happened, and his face when she told him was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all the careful stillness simply absent, replaced by something so open and genuine that she felt it like a physical warmth. He stood up and crossed the room and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was its own language, one she had learned to speak fluently. The summer passed with the easy rhythm of the ranch, the horses and the accounts and the long prairie evenings, and the way the light came across the grass at 7 o'clock and made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. Cora's pregnancy was uncomplicated, and Eduardo's wife Rosalinda, who had delivered several children and assisted with several more, was at hand with the calm authority of deep experience. Pete's sister Clara had, by summer, made it sufficiently clear that she and Tomás were courting, and Tomás had spoken to Eduardo, who had spoken to Pete, and the whole matter had been resolved with the slightly formal seriousness of people who took commitments seriously, which was to say it was resolved well. In September, the Crane trial came to its conclusion in the federal court in Wichita. Luther Crane was convicted on 12 counts and sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary. The conviction report noted the cooperation of a named individual whose testimony had been central to the case. Marshal Davis sent a letter to Orville the following week, formal and brief and professional in tone, informing him that the terms of the cooperation agreement had been satisfied in full, and that the federal warrant outstanding against him had been formally closed. Orville read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and sat with it for a moment. Cora was there. She had been there when he opened it, because she had known what it was by the marshal's stamp, and she had wanted to be in the room. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She was 8 months into her pregnancy, and the kitchen light was warm, and the horses were settled, and the autumn was pressing mild and golden against the windows, and he looked at her the way you look at the life you have been given when you know for certain you do not deserve it and have stopped arguing with that fact. "Cora," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart, which she noted and which she loved. Their son was born in October, 2 weeks after Resolution turned exactly 1 year old, which Cora considered a satisfying symmetry. Rosalinda was there, and Eduardo was outside in the yard being quietly anxious in the way that stoic men are anxious, and Pete was inside with his hat in his hands, and Clara was useful in the way that she was useful about everything. Orville was there the whole time. He held Cora's hand, and she compressed his quite hard during the worst of it, and he made no complaint whatsoever, which she considered further evidence of his excellent character. When the baby arrived, it was a boy with dark hair and gray eyes that were immediately, unmistakably his father's, and Orville held him with the same careful hands that had held the coffee cup the first night in the kitchen, and the look on his face was something Cora could not have described in words, but knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They named him James Orville Malone, James for the man who had built the ranch and Orville for the man who had saved it and who was now its future. The baby called everyone into immediate and tender disorder. Eduardo and Rosalinda arrived with food for a week. Pete Lusk sat by the cradle for approximately 2 hours with the expression of a man who has never considered the specific smallness of infant hands and is now considering it very thoroughly. Clara, who was organized about everything, had already prepared a list of what would be needed for the winter with the baby in the house, and presented it to Cora 3 days after the birth with the brisk tenderness of someone who expresses love through practicality, which Cora recognized because she was sometimes the same way. Young Tomás looked at the baby with the wide-eyed consideration of a 19-year-old, and then looked at Clara and looked back at the baby and looked at Eduardo, who said nothing, and looked at the sky with studied neutrality. Life on the ranch settled into the new shape. It was a fuller shape than any previous version. There was a baby in the house and horses in the corral and 2 hands who were almost family and a marriage that had arrived sideways out of a crisis and had become, in the way that the best things do, the solid center of everything. Cora ran the business and Orville ran the operations, and they consulted each other on every significant decision, which made everything better, because they thought differently about the same problems, and the combination was more accurate than either alone. The Morgan breeding program continued to develop, with Duchess producing her second foal the following spring, another colt, sound and promising, who they sold the following autumn for a price that made Pete whistle and Eduardo nod with quiet satisfaction. Orville wrote to his mother in Missouri. He had not written to her in years, because the years had been full of things he did not want to explain, and the silence had extended past the point of easy restoration. But he wrote now, because he had a life that was worth describing, and because a man with a son of his own understands his own origins differently, and because some secrets should not remain secrets simply because they are old. His mother wrote back within 3 weeks. She had remarried again, this time better, to a man named Harold who had a hardware store and was, she reported, completely ordinary in the best possible way. She wanted to know about the ranch. She wanted to know about the horses. She wanted to know about Cora. Cora wrote to her directly the next week, a long letter full of the kind of practical and affectionate detail that she suspected a mother would want, and the correspondence established itself as regular. And the following summer, Orville's mother and Harold came to Kansas on the westbound stage and spent 2 weeks at the Vaughn Malone place, which was what the locals had taken to calling it, with a familiarity that felt earned. The summer James turned 2. Clara and Tomás were married in the same Caldwell courthouse where Orville and Cora had been married, and Eduardo walked Clara down the aisle because her own father was not present, and Eduardo had taken on that particular authority over the preceding months with the quiet inevitability of something right. It was a warmer ceremony than the Malone wedding had been, because there were more people and more laughter, and at the dinner afterward on the ranch, Orville danced with Cora on the grass outside the house to a fiddle that Pete played with surprising skill, and James, who was 2 years old and extremely firm in his opinions, demanded to be danced with as well and received his wish. The following winter was a hard one, cold enough to challenge the horses and the ranch infrastructure both, but they had prepared well, and Rosalinda's experience and Eduardo's practical knowledge and Orville's problem-solving stubbornness combined to see everything through without significant loss. Cora managed the hay stores and the accounts and the breeding schedule and the baby, and the managing of all of these things simultaneously was difficult, and also was exactly the right size for the life she wanted, a life that used the full capacity of who she was. In the spring, she was expecting again. She told Orville on the porch this time in the evening, with James asleep inside and the first warm evening of the season making the air smell like new grass and distant rain. He turned to look at her with an expression that was quieter than the first time, not less full but fuller, because the first time had opened a capacity in him that was now simply available and did not need to be discovered again. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the right question. "I am very well," she said. He put his arm around her and they sat in the good quiet that they had learned to inhabit together. "We will need another cradle," he said. "Eduardo's nephew makes furniture," she said. "I have already spoken to him," he laughed. "Of course you have," he said. The second pregnancy was uncomplicated, and the second child, born in October as the first had been, was a girl, rosy and vocal, and immediately clear that she intended to be heard and accommodated. They named her Margaret, for no one specific, but because the name felt right and solid and suited her from the first moment. James, who was 3, inspected his sister with the serious assessment of a small person who has been told something significant is happening and is determining his own position on it. He reached out and touched her hand with one finger, with the same careful quality his father had, and then looked up at Orville and said, "Small," which Orville confirmed was accurate, and James nodded with the satisfaction of a person whose report on the situation has been validated. The ranch grew. Not explosively, not the way the dime novels described fortunes being made in the West, but steadily and properly, the way things grow when they are tended by people who know what they are doing and care about the outcome. The Morgan breeding program became known in the county, and then in the wider territory, and buyers came from as far as Missouri and Nebraska, and the horses that left the Vaughn Malone ranch went with solid documentation of bloodline and temperament and training, because that was the standard Cora had established and the standard Orville maintained. Eduardo's nephew built a new barn in the summer of the year Margaret turned 1, and Pete Lusk proved to have a gift for the business side of the operation, for negotiation and correspondence, which meant that Cora could focus on the horses themselves and the breeding strategy without also managing all of the external relationships. Pete and Clara, who were expecting their own first child by then, lived in a house a quarter-mile from the main ranch house on land that Cora had given them access to in recognition of 5 years of honest and loyal service. Orville hired 2 additional hands that year, men recommended by Calvin Hartley, the sheriff, because Hartley knew the county's people and had a good eye for character, and the recommendations proved sound. The community around Caldwell knew the Malone-Vaughn story by now, the way communities know things, which is to say they knew their own version of it, somewhat simplified and somewhat enlarged, with the horse theft and the fraud and the outlaw riding up the lane as the dramatic center of the story. Cora had mixed feelings about the public narrative, as she had mixed feelings about most narratives that reduced complex things to their most legible shape, but she found she could not resent it entirely because the core of it was true. The outlaw had returned her horses. He had said nobody should profit from taking what is yours, and then he had stayed. That was the truth, and whatever else anyone made of it was their own business. The evening that James turned 4 in October, with the harvest in and the horses prepared for the winter and Margaret sitting up on her own in the way of children who have recently discovered a new capability and are entirely satisfied with themselves about it. Cora sat on the porch with Orville in the late light, which came across the prairie at a long, flat angle in October and turned everything to gold. She thought about the woman she had been on this porch 2 years earlier, staring at an empty corral and believing that the future had been irretrievably taken from her. She thought about how wrong she had been, not about the threat, which had been real, but about the permanence of loss. The threat had been real and the loss had been real, and the fight to reclaim what was hers had been real and difficult and worth every moment of its difficulty. And then a man she did not know had ridden up the lane with 7 horses and said 7 words that had reached her in a place she had thought sealed, and the future had turned out to be something entirely different from what she had feared. "What are you thinking about?" Orville asked. She turned to look at him. The October light was on his face, the gray eyes and the healed scar and the lines that the years of outdoor work had put in around his eyes, which she found more beautiful than she had words for. "That first evening," she said, "you riding up the lane." He looked at her. "I thought you were going to reach for the rifle," he said. "I thought about it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I could see you thinking about it." She laughed. "And you dismounted anyway." "I had 7 of your horses," he said. "I thought the horses might be more persuasive than I was." "You underestimated yourself," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the light on the grass. "You know," he said, "I have thought about what I said that evening many times. Nobody should profit from taking what is yours. I said it about the horses." "I know," she said. "But I think," he said slowly, "that I might have been saying something else as well without knowing I was saying it." She waited. "I think I meant," he said, "that I had spent a long time being the kind of person who took things from people, and when I looked at what had been done to you, I was looking at the direct consequence of what I had been. Not you specifically, but you as the true shape of the outcome, and I could not let it stand." She looked at him for a long moment. "And now?" she asked. "Now I am the kind of person who tends what is here," he said, "which is where I should have been all along." She took his hand. The children were inside, and the horses were in the barn, and the October light was sliding toward evening, and the Kansas grass was doing what it always did, moving in the wind with its quiet, inexhaustible patience. And Cora Malone, née Vaughn, held her husband's hand on the porch of the ranch. She had saved and thought about all the various forms that belonging takes, and was quietly and completely happy. The years moved through the ranch, the way years move through a place that is being properly loved, leaving marks that are mostly improvements. James grew into a serious, bright-eyed boy who could sit a horse at 5, and was reading at 4, and who had his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and some quality that was entirely his own, a particular quality of attention toward the world that manifested as a constant and delightful curiosity about how everything worked. He asked questions constantly and required actual answers rather than deflections, which his parents provided because they were both people who believed that honest answers to honest questions were a form of respect. Margaret was exactly what she had seemed from the first moment, vocal and clear and entirely certain of what she wanted, which made her occasionally challenging and consistently wonderful. She had Cora's dark hair and Orville's gray eyes and an absolute refusal to be underestimated, which Cora recognized with a particular private satisfaction. In the summer of James's 5th year, Clara and Tomás's son was born, a boy they named Eduardo after the man who had walked Clara down the aisle, and Eduardo Sr. held the baby with the expression of a man who has received a compliment in a language he does not entirely speak but fully understands. In that same summer, Cora found herself expecting a 3rd time. She told Orville on the porch again in the evening because that was where they told each other important things, and he received the news with the equanimity of a man who has discovered that joy is not a finite resource. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. The ranch is large enough, he said. The ranch is large enough, she agreed. The third child was a boy, born in February of the following year, in the coldest part of a cold winter, which seemed to agree with him because he was the most placid of the three, a wide-eyed, mild-tempered infant who looked at the world with a thoughtful expression entirely out of place on someone 2 days old. They named him William, after nothing in particular except that it suited him, and James, who was 6 and had already demonstrated leadership qualities of a slightly alarming order, took his role as eldest brother with elaborate seriousness, and immediately began preparing to teach William about horses at the earliest possible opportunity. Margaret, who was 2, was not entirely certain about William at first, and then decided that he was acceptable, and thereafter tolerated him with the gracious condescension of an older sibling who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. The ranch was full. It was full of people and horses and children and work and conversation, and the accumulated detail of shared years. And every evening when the work was done, and the children were settled and the horses were quiet, Cora and Orville sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked in the easy way that people talk when they are completely known by the person they are talking to. One evening in the autumn of William's second year, Orville received a letter from Missouri that he read at the table and then set down with an expression that was considered and careful. "My mother tells me Harold has had some difficulty with his health," he said. "Serious?" Cora asked. "Not immediately serious, but the kind of difficulty that bears watching." He paused. "She is not alone with it, but she is getting older." Cora looked at him. "You could go to Missouri to see her," she said. "I could," he said. "I have been thinking about it." He hesitated. "There is also the matter of the farm outside Springfield, my father's farm, which my mother still holds technically. She has had a caretaker on it, but the caretaker is leaving and she is unsure what to do with it." "She could sell it," Cora said. "Yes," he said. Or he paused in the way he paused when he was organizing something he was not certain about. "Or we could consider whether there is a purpose for it. I am not suggesting anything specific. I am thinking aloud." "Think aloud to me," she said. "Eduardo has his nephew here," he said. "And Tomás has his family. Pete and Clara are established. The ranch is running well with the people it has." Another pause. "I have thought sometimes about whether there is a future in which the Missouri farm becomes something. Whether James or Margaret or William might want it someday, whether we might want it or something like it eventually." Cora considered this with the careful attention she gave to all significant questions. "I think," she said, "that you should go to Missouri to see your mother." "I would like you to come," he said. She looked at him. "I would like that very much," she said. They went to Missouri in the spring, when William was old enough to travel comfortably, and James and Margaret were old enough to understand that the journey was a significant one. Eduardo and Rosalinda managed the ranch in their absence with the competence that 7 years of shared history had built, and Pete and Clara and Tomás were there as well, and the ranch was in better hands than it had ever been left in. The journey by train from Wichita to Springfield took 2 days and was, for all 3 children, the most extraordinary experience of their short lives, because none of them had been on a train before, and the speed and noise and movement of it produced reactions ranging from James's analytical fascination to Margaret's imperious demand that someone explain the engine to her, to William's complete and beatific calm, which he maintained through the entire journey by looking out the window with the expression of a philosopher encountering new data. Orville's mother, whose name was Agnes, was a small woman with silver hair and gray eyes that were unmistakably the source of her son's, and she came down the front steps of her house in Springfield with a quickness that belied her age and embraced her son with both arms, and then stepped back and looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite accusation and not quite relief, but something in between. The expression of a mother who has been worried for a very long time and is only now allowing herself to stop. Then she looked at Cora, and Cora looked at her. And something passed between them in that first look that was beyond language, a mutual recognition, a seeing of what the other person had done and what it had cost and what had been built from it. Agnes embraced Cora next, and then crouched down to James's level and said hello in the direct way that children respond to, and the visit began. Harold was, as Agnes's letter had suggested, managing, and the difficulty was manageable for now, and the doctors were optimistic. He was a quiet man who made excellent coffee and had opinions about carpentry, and was very clearly devoted to Agnes, and Orville watched him with the particular attention of a son who is deciding whether his mother has been well loved in his absence, and then relaxed in the way that indicates a favorable conclusion. The Springfield farm was, as Orville had said, still standing. They drove out to see it on the second day, and it was smaller than the Vaughn Malone ranch but well situated, with good water and good soil, and a house that needed work but was structurally sound. James walked through every room with his systematic 6-year-old assessment and declared it a good house. Margaret stood in the dooryard and looked at the fields with the considering expression she brought to everything, and said it was smaller than their ranch, which it was. William sat in the grass and appeared to be in conversation with a beetle, which was consistent with his character. Orville stood beside Cora in the doorway of the farmhouse, and she felt what he was feeling, the complicated, layered emotion of a man returning to the physical site of a difficult origin, and finding it neither as painful nor as large as memory had made it. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," she said, "that this is the kind of place that could be something if it had the right people in it." "And do you think the right people exist?" he said. She thought about Eduardo's nephew, who made furniture and was good with horses and had no permanent place of his own. She thought about the range of possibilities that existed when you had a working ranch producing trained horses with solid bloodlines, and when you had a farm in Missouri that could receive and board horses while buyers from the East came to look at them, a staging place, a nearer market. "I think we should talk to Eduardo's nephew when we get home," she said. He looked at her. Then he smiled, the full warm smile that she had learned to read as the signal that he was entirely certain of something. "Yes," he said. The visit to Springfield lasted 10 days, and at the end of it, Agnes had held each of the 3 Malone children on her lap at one point or another, and told James stories about his father's childhood in Missouri, which James received with the grave attention of a family historian taking an oral testimony, and had given Margaret a small silver thimble that had belonged to Orville's grandmother, which Margaret instantly designated as the most important object in her possession, and had told William, who was 2 and had limited conversational range, that he had the best eyes she had ever seen, which pleased him. Agnes had also told Cora privately, while Orville and Harold were looking at the barn, that she was grateful in a way that could not be adequately expressed, that Cora had written first and had made the correspondence possible, and had brought her son back when Agnes had believed that geography and silence had made the distance permanent. Cora had said, as she usually did when confronted with a gratitude she did not feel she had earned, that Orville had done all of the important work himself. And Agnes had said that this was exactly the thing a woman who was good for her son would say, which Cora suspected was the highest compliment Agnes offered. They returned to Kansas in late spring, to a ranch that had managed excellently without them and horses that were glad to see the familiar people and children who were genuinely happy to be home, because home was a real thing that had been built carefully and was worth coming back to. In the summer, Eduardo's nephew, whose name was Felipe, agreed to take the Springfield farm on a long-term tenancy arrangement, and within 3 years had established it as a successful staging and boarding operation for the Vaughn Malone horses moving into eastern markets, which expanded the business in ways that the county limited market could not have sustained alone. Felipe was not alone in this enterprise, because by then he had married a capable woman from Springfield named Ruth who had a gift for the books and the correspondence, and who ran the business side of the operation with a precision that even Cora, a precise woman herself, found impressive. The ranch in Kansas, the Vaughn Malone place, ran on. The seasons came and went in the way that seasons come and go in places that are being properly attended to, not without difficulty, because drought came and flooding came and markets shifted and prices fluctuated, and the work never stopped being hard, but with the specific manageable difficulty of things that are addressed in time, by people who trust each other, and who have the combined knowledge and the combined stubbornness to see through whatever the year throws at them. James grew into a young man who wanted, above all other things, to breed horses, and who had the theoretical knowledge and the practical skill, and the innate feel for it that made this not merely a wish but a clear capability. At 16, he was managing a portion of the breeding program alongside his mother, under her supervision, which she provided not because he needed much supervision, but because she valued the proximity and the conversation and the particular pleasure of watching someone you love discover their competence. Margaret, who was interested in everything that was not horses, went to the county school in Caldwell, and then, when she was 16, to the women's college in Lawrence, because she had read about it and had decided she was going and had said so to her parents in the tone she used for things that were not negotiable. And her parents had recognized the tone, because both of them had it as well and had seen no reason to contest the point. William grew up moderate and thoughtful and steady, the kind of person who becomes the foundation of whatever they are part of, not the loudest or the most visible but the one everything else is anchored to. He liked the land itself, the soil and the crops and the management of water, and it seemed to Cora and Orville that the Springfield farm, which was partly agricultural, might in time be exactly the right scale and shape for a person of William's particular inclinations. The evenings on the porch continued. This was the constant, the thing that persisted through all the seasons and changes and arrivals and departures. The evening on the porch, the two of them, the Kansas dark and the stars, and the sound of the horses, and the conversation or the comfortable silence that knew itself to be its own kind of conversation. On one such evening when James was 17 and Margaret was 15 and William was 12, Orville said to her, entirely without preamble, as was his way, that he thought he was the happiest he had ever been in his life. Cora looked at the stars for a moment. "That is a large thing to say," she said. "It is a true thing to say," he said. She looked at him. "I am also," she said. He took her hand. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Something I have thought about for a long time but not said directly." She waited. "I think about that first evening still," he said. "Often. I think about the woman standing in the yard who had lost everything she had worked for and who was still standing upright, who did not reach for the rifle, who invited me inside and sat across the table and looked at me like I was something worth the trouble of understanding." He paused. "I had not been looked at that way in a very long time. I am not sure I had ever been looked at quite that way." Cora was quiet for a moment. "I looked at you that way," she said, "because you were holding the lead rope to 7 horses I had thought were gone forever, and you had the expression of a man who had done something right and was not entirely sure what to do with that feeling." "That is an accurate description of how I felt," he said. "I know," she said. "It is one of the things about you that I loved from the beginning, that you felt things correctly, you just did not always know what to do with them yet." He turned to look at her. "And now," he said, "now you know what to do with them," she said. "You have known for a long time." He lifted her hand and held it against his chest, and she felt his heartbeat steady under her palm. And the night was warm, and the horses were quiet, and somewhere in the house she could hear William reading, aloud to himself the way he did before he slept, the low, comfortable murmur of it drifting out through the window. And the life that she had built and almost lost and then rebuilt, and then expanded beyond what she had imagined possible, was present all around her in every direction. In the grass and the horses and the warm and solid hand holding hers. Nobody should profit from taking what is yours. He had said it about 7 horses. He had meant something larger, though neither of them had known it yet. He had meant that what belongs to you, the land and the work and the love and the future you have built, is worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth riding 2 days across the Kansas plain in the wrong direction to recover. He had meant that the world contains people who take and people who return, and that he had decided, in the specific moment when Cutter's story reached him with the full clarity of its ugliness, to be the kind of person who returns. He had returned her horses. He had stayed. And the life they had built from that returning was exactly the right size, exactly the right shape, exactly what a life should be when 2 people decide to be honest with each other from the first evening, and to go on being honest every evening after that, which is not the simplest thing in the world, but it is the most enduring. The stars moved overhead in their enormous, indifferent rotation, and Cora Malone sat on the porch of her ranch in the Kansas summer and held her husband's hand and was completely, entirely, and permanently at home.